The first thing you need to understand about humans is that they don't follow the rules. Not their own rules, not ours, and certainly not the sacred laws of warfare that have governed the galaxy for 3,000 cycles. So when our tactical screens showed a single human infiltration pod burrowing into the hull of the Keth'moran Empire's most feared Dreadnought, the Void Reaper, nobody laughed. We just stared in horrified fascination. "Sir," Communications Officer Veltar clicked his mandibles nervously. "Are we absolutely certain that pod contains only one human?" Commander Zixthal's eye stalk swiveled toward the tactical display, where a tiny red dot pulsed against the massive outline of the enemy mothership. "Scan it again." "Already did, sir. 3 times. Single life form. Human biosignature. Mass approximately 72 kilograms. Weapons. Standard human military loadout. Pulse rifle. Plasma charges. Some sort of cutting tool." The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of our engines. The Void Reaper stretched across our view screen like a metallic mountain, bristling with enough firepower to sterilize a planet. Its crew of 12,000 Keth'morans had been terrorizing the outer colonies for months, leaving nothing but ash and regret in their wake, and now somehow, impossibly, one human had decided to pay them a visit. "This is either the most brilliant tactical maneuver in galactic history," I muttered from my position at the sensor array, "or the most spectacular suicide attempt ever recorded." Commander Zixthal's laugh sounded like grinding metal. "With humans, those two categories tend to overlap." The human's name was Marcus Vale, according to the intercepted communications from the nearby colony ship, a demolitions expert who'd volunteered for what everyone assumed was a reconnaissance mission. Nobody, not even his own species, expected him to actually breach the enemy hull. The plan was simple: get close, gather intelligence, retreat before the Keth'morans noticed. Except Marcus Vale apparently hadn't read that memo. "Sir, the human is inside," Veltar announced, his voice climbing an octave. "He's moving through their ventilation systems." Of course he was. Humans had this peculiar habit of treating impossibly narrow spaces as personal highways. While civilized species designed their ships with proper corridors, humans seemed to view ductwork as perfectly reasonable transportation infrastructure. "Are the Keth'morans aware of the intrusion?" Zixthal asked. "Not yet. Their security protocols are, well, they are designed to detect armies, not individuals." The Keth'morans had ruled through fear for so long that they'd forgotten what desperation looked like. Their massive ships were built like fortresses, with enough armor to withstand orbital bombardments and enough weapons to level continents. But fortresses have a weakness. They are designed to keep large threats out, not small ones in. "Where's he headed?" I asked, adjusting my sensors to track the human's movement through the ship's superstructure. "Appears to be—" "Wait." Veltar's mandibles clicked rapidly. "This can't be right." "What?" "He's heading for the engine core." The bridge erupted in nervous chittering. The Void Reaper's engine core was protected by 17 layers of security, radiation shielding that would kill most species in minutes, and a containment field that could incinerate anything that didn't belong there. It was essentially a miniature star wrapped in the most advanced technology the Keth'moran Empire could produce. "Sensors must be malfunctioning," Zixthal declared. "No single individual could possibly—" "Sir," Veltar interrupted, "he's just disabled the first security checkpoint." We watched in stunned silence as Marcus Vale somehow convinced the Keth'moran security systems that he belonged there. Later analysis would reveal that he'd jury-rigged a scanner from their own technology, essentially creating a skeleton key that opened every door in the ship. But at the time, it looked like magic. "How is he doing this?" someone whispered. "Humans," I said, "have this annoying tendency to treat advanced technology like particularly complicated door locks." The truth was more disturbing than that. Humans possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand how things worked, even when those things were designed by entirely different species using completely alien principles. They called it engineering intuition, but the rest of us called it deeply unsettling. "Sir, he's reached the engine compartment," Veltar reported. "The radiation levels in that section would kill a Keth'moran in 30 seconds, and humans, unknown. Their radiation tolerance is inconsistent." That was putting it mildly. Human physiology was a puzzle that had confounded xenobiologists for decades. They could survive in environments that would kill most civilized species, yet they could also die from ingesting perfectly harmless plant matter. They were simultaneously the most fragile and most resilient species in the galaxy. "What's he doing in there?" Zixthal demanded. "Appears to be, sir, this is going to sound crazy, but it looks like he's performing maintenance." Maintenance? He's accessing the primary control systems, adjusting power flow distributions, modifying containment field parameters. The implications hit us like a meteor strike. The Void Reaper's engines were the most closely guarded secret in the Keth'moran Empire. Their power source was based on technology that had taken their species centuries to develop, and Marcus Vale was apparently treating it like a particularly complex home appliance. "He's not performing maintenance," I realized with growing horror. "He's reprogramming it." "That's impossible," Zixthal protested. "The security algorithms alone would take teams of specialists months to crack." "Sir," Veltar's voice was barely a whisper, "he's been in there for exactly 12 minutes. The Keth'morans finally noticed something was wrong when their engine efficiency readings began climbing beyond theoretical maximums. Their chief engineer, a creature named Gorthak, who'd spent his entire career maintaining those systems, watched in disbelief as power output increased by 30%. Then 40%, then 50%. "Alert the bridge," Gorthak ordered his subordinates. "We have a catastrophic system malfunction." What Gorthak didn't know was that Marcus Vale had spent the last 6 months studying captured Keth'moran technology. What he'd learned was that their engines were deliberately running at 70% efficiency as a safety measure. The other 30% was locked away behind security protocols that would take years to properly bypass, unless of course you were a human who didn't particularly care about safety protocols. "Sir, the Void Reaper is accelerating," Veltar announced. "They are moving away from the convoy. Where are they going? Unknown, but at their current rate of acceleration they will reach the system's edge in approximately 2 hours. That was when the first explosion shook the enemy mothership. It wasn't large by Starship standards, just a small detonation in one of the secondary power conduits. But it was perfectly placed to trigger a cascade failure in the backup systems. The Keth'morans found themselves dealing with power fluctuations throughout the ship, emergency lighting flickering on and off, and the growing realization that something was very, very wrong. "Search every section," Gorthak commanded. "Find the source of the malfunction." But Marcus Vale was already 3 levels away, moving through the ship's infrastructure like a particularly determined ghost. He'd identified the key weaknesses in their design, the points where a small amount of precisely applied damage could cause maximum disruption. "He's not just sabotaging the ship," I breathed, watching the tactical display. "He's systematically dismantling it." "Impossible," Zixthal repeated, but his conviction was wavering. "One individual cannot destroy a ship of that size. Tell that to the Keth'morans." The second explosion was larger, taking out the primary communication array. The Void Reaper went dark, its transponder signals disappearing from our screens. For a moment we thought they'd been destroyed entirely. Then they reappeared, moving at an impossible speed toward the outer system. "Sir," Veltar's voice cracked, "they are approaching 70% light speed. That's impossible. Their engines aren't rated for." The third explosion lit up the darkness like a miniature sun. The Void Reaper's hull buckled, atmosphere streaming from dozens of breaches. But the ship kept accelerating, its engines somehow still functional, despite the catastrophic damage. "He's not trying to destroy the ship," I realized. "He's turning it into a weapon." The Keth'morans had figured it out too. Their emergency broadcasts flooded the communication channels, desperate calls for assistance that grew more frantic by the minute. Their chief engineer was screaming about containment failures and cascade reactions, while their captain demanded to know why they couldn't regain control of their own vessel. But Marcus Vale had anticipated their countermeasures. Every system they tried to access had been subtly modified, every backup protocol quietly sabotaged. The Keth'morans found themselves trapped aboard their own ship, passengers on a journey they couldn't stop or control. "Sir," Veltar whispered, "the Void Reaper is heading directly for the Keth'moran supply depot." The supply depot was a massive orbital facility that served as the primary staging ground for the Empire's military operations in this sector. It housed enough munitions to equip 1,000 ships, enough fuel to power a fleet for years, and enough personnel to crew a small armada. It was also completely defenseless against a 12-kilometer-long Dreadnought traveling at 70% light speed. "Can they stop him?" Zixthal asked. "The depot's defense systems are designed to repel external attacks," I said. "They are not equipped to handle a ship that size moving at that velocity." And the Keth'morans? They are trying to regain control of their engines, but the human has locked them out of their own systems. They are passengers now. The irony was delicious. The Keth'moran Empire had built the Void Reaper to be the ultimate expression of their military might, a ship so powerful that entire star systems would surrender rather than face it in battle. They'd made it nearly invulnerable to outside attack, with armor that could withstand any weapon and shields that could deflect the most powerful energy beams, but they'd never considered the possibility that their greatest enemy might not be outside the ship at all. Marcus Vale had been inside their fortress for exactly 47 minutes. In that time he'd turned their most powerful weapon into their most vulnerable liability. The Void Reaper was no longer a ship under their control. It was a guided missile with a crew of 12,000 unwilling passengers. Time to impact? Zixthal asked quietly. 17 minutes, Veltar replied. And the human? Still aboard, still alive, still... He paused, checking his readings. Sir, he's in the weapon control center now. What could he possibly want with their weapons? The answer came in the form of a massive energy discharge that lit up our sensors like a supernova. The Void Reaper's primary cannon, a weapon capable of cracking planetary crusts, had fired at maximum power, but instead of targeting the supply depot, it had aimed at empty space. He's using their own weapons to adjust their trajectory, I breathed. He's fine-tuning the impact angle. To what end? Maximum damage. He's not just going to hit the depot, he's going to hit it at precisely the right angle to trigger a chain reaction in their munitions storage. The Keth'morans had realized what was happening. Their communications were a chaos of panic and desperation, officers screaming orders that couldn't be followed, engineers reporting systems that couldn't be repaired. Some of them had even begun evacuating to the escape pods, abandoning their posts in a desperate attempt to save themselves. But Marcus Vale had anticipated that too. The escape pod bays were sealed, their launch mechanisms mysteriously offline. The crew of the Void Reaper was trapped aboard their own ship, forced to watch as their ultimate weapon became their ultimate doom. 12 minutes to impact, Veltar announced. Sir, I said we should probably move to a safe distance. Zixthal nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the tactical display. Has anyone else noticed that the human hasn't attempted to escape? It was true. Marcus Vale had access to the same escape pods that the Keth'morans couldn't use, but he'd made no effort to reach them. Instead, he'd taken up position in the ship's command center, apparently content to ride the Void Reaper all the way to its final destination. Maybe he can't, Veltar suggested. Maybe he's trapped too. Or maybe, I said slowly, he never intended to leave. The thought sent a chill through the bridge. Humans were known for their willingness to sacrifice themselves for their causes, but this was something else entirely. Marcus Vale had turned himself into a living weapon, a guided missile with a pulse and a sense of purpose. 8 minutes to impact, Veltar called out. The Void Reaper continued its inexorable approach to the supply depot, its massive bulk growing larger on the tactical display with each passing second. The Keth'morans had given up trying to regain control of their ship. Their final transmissions were nothing but prayers to gods who had apparently abandoned them. Sir, I said, we are about to witness the single most effective act of sabotage in recorded history, and the single most expensive suicide, Zixthal added grimly. 5 minutes to impact. The supply depot had finally realized what was happening. Their own communications were flooding the channels now, desperate calls for evacuation assistance and frantic attempts to contact the Keth'moran fleet. But there was no time for evacuation, no possibility of escape. The Void Reaper was too close, moving too fast, carrying too much momentum to be stopped by anything short of a miracle. 2 minutes to impact. Marcus Vale was still alive, still conscious, still monitoring the ship's systems from the command center. Whatever he'd done to the Keth'moran technology, it had worked perfectly. The Void Reaper was exactly where he wanted it to be, moving at exactly the speed he'd calculated, aimed at exactly the right point to cause maximum destruction. 30 seconds to impact. The silence on our bridge was deafening. Even the background hum of our engine seemed muted, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. 10 seconds. 5. Impact. The explosion was visible from 17 light minutes away. The explosion that ended Part 1 was just the opening act. What followed was a chain reaction that redefined our understanding of the phrase catastrophic failure. The Void Reaper struck the Keth'moran supply depot at precisely the angle Marcus Vale had calculated, its 12-kilometer hull punching through the facility's outer shell like a spear through tissue paper. The impact triggered a cascade of secondary explosions as munition storage bays detonated in sequence, each blast feeding the next until the entire depot became a miniature star. "Sweet, merciful void," Veltar whispered, his mandibles chattering as he stared at the sensor readings. "The energy release is off the scale." Commander Zixthal's eye stalks retracted instinctively, even though we were safe at our current distance. How much ordnance was stored in that facility? "According to our intelligence reports," I said, cross-referencing the tactical database, "enough to supply the entire Keth'moran Third Fleet for 18 months. Was. The correction hung in the air like a death sentence. Where the supply depot had once orbited, there was now only an expanding cloud of superheated plasma and twisted metal. The explosion had been so violent that it had actually knocked several nearby asteroids out of their orbital paths, sending them tumbling through space like cosmic debris. But here's the thing about humans that we should have remembered. They don't just break things. They break things in ways that keep on breaking other things long after they are gone." "Sir," Veltar's voice cracked with disbelief, "I'm detecting multiple secondary explosions throughout the system." "What? Where?" "Everywhere. The shockwave from the depot destruction has reached the Keth'moran mining platforms. Their fusion reactors are going critical." Of course they were. Marcus Vale had somehow calculated not just the primary impact, but the cascading effects that would ripple outward from the explosion. The Keth'morans had positioned their mining platforms in a neat orbital arrangement, each one feeding processed materials to the next in an efficient supply chain. It was a masterpiece of industrial engineering. It was also a perfect setup for a domino effect that would destroy everything in the system. "How many platforms?" Zixthal demanded. 17 confirmed, 3 more showing signs of reactor instability, and the personnel, approximately 40,000 Keth'morans, plus automated systems and defensive installations. The numbers were staggering. In the span of less than 2 hours, one human had managed to cripple an entire military sector. The Third Fleet supply lines were gone, their mining operations were collapsing, and their primary staging area had been transformed into an expanding field of radioactive debris. "Sir," I said, studying the long-range sensors, "we have incoming Keth'moran ships." "How many?" 12 dreadnoughts, 43 cruisers, and approximately 200 smaller vessels. The entire Third Fleet from the looks of it. They were too late, of course. By the time the Keth'moran reinforcements arrived, there would be nothing left to reinforce except wreckage and regret. But their approach raised an interesting question. What would they do when they discovered that their most feared weapon had been turned against them by a single human? "Are we detecting any survivors from the Void Reaper?" Veltar asked. I checked the sensor logs, scanning through the debris field for any sign of life pods or emergency beacons. Negative. The ship was completely destroyed in the impact. "Including the human?" "Including Marcus Vale, but even as I said the words, something nagged at the back of my mind. Humans had this annoying habit of surviving things that should have killed them, usually through methods that defied both logic and physics. I ran the sensor sweep again, this time looking for any anomalies in the debris pattern. "Wait," I said, adjusting the resolution, "there's something here." "What kind of something?" "A section of the Void Reaper's command center. It's intact." The bridge fell silent except for the steady beep of the sensor array. According to our readings, a roughly spherical section of the enemy mothership had somehow survived the impact and explosion. It was drifting among the debris, its hull scarred but unbroken, its internal atmosphere still pressurized. "How is that possible?" Zixthal asked. "The impact should have vaporized everything. Unless," I said slowly, "someone had reinforced that section beforehand." The implications were staggering. Marcus Vale hadn't just sabotaged the Keth'moran ship and turned it into a weapon. He'd also prepared a survival pod from the enemy's own materials, crafting a makeshift escape vehicle that could withstand the very explosion he'd engineered. "Is he alive?" Veltar whispered. "Scanning." I focused our most sensitive instruments on the drifting section, searching for any sign of life. Confirmed. Single human biosignature, weak but stable. "That magnificent, terrifying, impossible creature," Zixthal breathed. "He survived his own suicide mission." But our celebration was premature. The approaching Keth'moran fleet had detected the same anomaly we had, and they were not pleased. Their communications were a mixture of rage and disbelief as they realized that the architect of their disaster was still alive, floating among the wreckage of their most important facility. "Sir," Veltar announced, "the Keth'moran flagship is moving to intercept the debris section. Can we reach it first?" "Negative. They have a significant head start, and their ships are faster in this configuration." We watched helplessly as the enemy fleet converged on Marcus Vale's improvised survival pod. The lead ship, a massive dreadnought called the Bone Crusher, extended its salvage arms and began pulling the damaged section into its cargo bay. Within minutes, the human who had single-handedly crippled their military operation was aboard their flagship. "They are going to interrogate him," I said. "Find out how he did it, how much he knows about their technology. And then they are going to make him pay for what he's done," Zaxel added grimly. But we were underestimating Marcus Vale again. The man who had turned the Void Reaper into a guided missile wasn't finished with his war against the Keth'moran Empire. He was just getting started. "Sir," Veltar's voice was barely a whisper, "I'm detecting unusual energy signatures from the Bone Crusher." "What kind of signatures?" "Power fluctuations, system malfunctions. It's almost like the Keth'moran flagship exploded, not the spectacular, chain reaction explosion that had destroyed the supply depot. This was different, a precise, surgical detonation that split the ship's hull along its structural weak points, venting atmosphere and crew into the void, while leaving the engines and primary systems intact." "How?" Zaxel demanded. "He was unconscious. He was captured." "Sir," I said, studying the sensor data, "I don't think Marcus Vale was ever unconscious. The evidence was there in the energy patterns, the precise timing of the explosion, the surgical nature of the damage. Marcus Vale had spent his time in the makeshift survival pod doing more than just staying alive. He'd been preparing for the next phase of his mission. He planted something," Veltar realized. "Something in the debris, something that would activate when brought aboard an enemy ship." "Not just something," I corrected. "Everything." The truth was even more audacious than we'd imagined. Marcus Vale had loaded his improvised escape pod with every piece of Keth'moran technology he could salvage from the Void Reaper, along with a collection of human-made modifications that turned each component into a miniature weapon. When the Bone Crusher's salvage crew brought him aboard, they'd essentially imported a Trojan horse filled with technological sabotage. "The other ships are maintaining distance," Veltar reported. "They have realized that approaching the debris field might be dangerous, but it was too late for caution. Marcus Vale had already demonstrated that he could turn any Keth'moran technology against itself, and now he was aboard one of their most advanced vessels, with access to systems that could reach every ship in the fleet." "Sir," I said, watching the tactical display, "the remaining ships are starting to show power fluctuations. All of them. All of them. It was impossible. But the evidence was right there on our screens. Every Keth'moran ship in the fleet was experiencing the same pattern of system failures, the same cascade of malfunctions that had preceded the Void Reaper's transformation into a weapon. Marcus Vale had somehow managed to transmit his sabotage programs to the entire Third Fleet. "How is he doing this?" Zixthal asked. "He's one human on one ship. He can't possibly reach all of them. Unless," I said, studying the communication patterns between the enemy vessels, "he's using their own network against them." The Keth'moran fleet operated on a sophisticated command and control system that allowed real-time coordination between hundreds of ships. It was a masterpiece of military communication technology, enabling the fleet commander to issue orders that would be instantly relayed to every vessel under his command. It was also the perfect vector for a computer virus designed by someone who understood exactly how their systems worked. "He's not just sabotaging individual ships," I breathed. "He's sabotaging the entire fleet through their own communication network." The Keth'morans realized what was happening at approximately the same time we did. Their desperate attempts to isolate their ships from the network came too late. Marcus Vale's programs had already propagated through every connected system, turning their own coordination protocols into weapons of self-destruction. "Sir," Veltar announced, "the first cruiser just lost main power." "And the second," I added, watching another ship go dark on the tactical display. "Third cruiser is venting atmosphere. Fourth cruiser's engines are overloading. Fifth cruiser is— I can see them, Zixthal interrupted, staring at the view screen where the Keth'moran Third Fleet was systematically destroying itself. How long can this continue? As long as Marcus Vale remains conscious, I said, and given his track record, that might be longer than any of us expect. The irony was exquisite. The Keth'moran Empire had spent centuries perfecting their military technology, creating ships that were virtually invulnerable to external attack. Their fleet coordination systems were so advanced that they could operate as a single unified fighting force capable of overwhelming any enemy through sheer coordination and firepower, but they'd never considered the possibility that their greatest strength could become their greatest weakness in the hands of someone who understood both human ingenuity and alien technology. "Sir," Veltar's voice was filled with awe, "we are witnessing the complete destruction of the Keth'moran Third Fleet by a single human operative." "Not destruction," I corrected, watching as ship after ship succumbed to Marcus Vale's sabotage. Conversion, because that's what was really happening. Marcus Vale wasn't just destroying the enemy fleet, he was turning each ship into a weapon that would target the others. The Keth'morans found themselves fighting not just their own technology, but each other, as their compromised systems began identifying friendly vessels as hostile targets. The battle lasted exactly 47 minutes. When it was over, the Keth'moran Third Fleet had been reduced to debris and distress beacons. Their most advanced ships, their most experienced crews, their most sophisticated technology had all been turned against them by a single human who had never fired a shot. "Sir," Veltar whispered, "I'm detecting an escape pod launching from the wreckage of the Bone Crusher." "Marcus Vale?" "Confirmed. Single human biosignature. He's alive and apparently uninjured." Of course he was. The man who had survived the destruction of the Void Reaper, infiltrated an enemy flagship, and single-handedly destroyed an entire fleet, wasn't about to be stopped by something as trivial as explosive decompression. "Sir," I said, watching the escape pod's trajectory, "he's heading for the outer system. There's a human colony ship in that direction. Should we intercept him?" Zixthal was quiet for a long moment, his eye stalks focused on the tactical display where the remains of the Keth'moran Third Fleet drifted in expanding clouds of debris. Finally he spoke. "No, I think we have seen enough of human military capabilities for one day. But sir, the intelligence value, Zixthal interrupted, is that humans are significantly more dangerous than we ever imagined, and Marcus Vale has just demonstrated that they don't need fleets or superweapons to win wars. They just need to be sufficiently motivated and insufficiently supervised." The escape pod disappeared into the darkness of deep space, carrying with it the human who had redefined our understanding of asymmetric warfare. In the span of less than 3 hours, Marcus Vale had eliminated an entire military sector, destroyed the Keth'moran Empire's most important supply depot, and converted their most powerful fleet into scrap metal. "Sir," Veltar asked quietly, "what do we tell command about this incident?" "The truth," Zixthal replied, "that we witnessed a single human operative achieve what would have required an entire battle fleet to accomplish, and that we should probably reconsider our assumptions about human military potential. And Marcus Vale just became the most wanted individual in the galaxy. Every species that has ever considered humanity a threat will be looking for him. Will they find him?" I studied the trajectory data one more time, calculating the escape pod's course toward the human colony ship. "Sir, given what we have observed today, I suspect that Marcus Vale will be exactly where he wants to be, when he wants to be there. And where's that? Wherever the next impossible mission requires a human who doesn't believe in the word impossible." The tactical display showed empty space where the Keth'moran Third Fleet had once patrolled, nothing but debris and radiation where their supply depot had once operated. In the distance, a small escape pod continued its journey toward the outer system, carrying the architect of the most audacious military operation in recorded galactic history. Marcus Vale had snuck into an enemy mothership and made it a tomb, but more than that, he'd proven that humans didn't just fight wars differently than the rest of us, they fought them better. And that perhaps was the most terrifying revelation of all.